Well, hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College. And I want to say a special thank you to the members of the college who's are contributing to it through Patreon. It really does make a big difference and makes it possible for me to do this work. So thank you again for your support. It's very much appreciated. Now then, we have been examining the whole story of the lost tribes of Israel. That Israel, as you know, if you've been following this series, the state of Israel was split in two after the death of King Solomon, the son of King David. And the northern kingdom was set up with 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom continued with the successor to Solomon, Rehoboam, as a separate kingdom. The northern kingdom had its own king and a lineage of kings that came from that. But they were all, first of all, the northern ones were taken away by the Assyrians and moved to other places. We'll talk about that in a minute. The southern kingdom continued for a while longer. A lot of them were also taken away by the Assyrians, but they continued in Jerusalem until they were taken away by the Babylonians and later returned. And they became the Jews. So you have to understand that while the Jews were Israelites, not all Israelites were Jews. That's the point. And we're going to explore what happened to those lost tribes. In fact, we have been exploring in the earlier programs. So if you haven't watched those, I do recommend it. Now, this lecture is called The Lost Tribes of Israel Go to Europe, which is a rather fascinating idea. We don't tend to think of Israelites in Europe except perhaps the Jews in Europe. But there were, and certainly still are, descendants from those lost tribes. So we're going to look at that in this video and how that came to be. Now, to recap, the Assyrian Empire expanded westwards across the Euphrates River in around 724 BC. They defeated a coalition of small kingdoms which included Syria and Samaria. Samaria is another name for this 10-tribe kingdom of the north. And this began deportations of the tribes to Assyria itself and also to parts of Media. Now, Media is part of Persia, or Iran, we would call it now, up near the Caspian Sea, the very northwestern part, you could say, of Iran. So that we have a map here. You can see Samaria, Israel, and the people being deported. They're called the Gimri, and I'll come to that again in a minute. So some of them were taken to Assyria and some were taken to Media. So the Israelites were first settled in Gozan. Gozan is a province on the Habor River and around Hala on the Tigris River. The river Tigris and Euphrates, the two rivers together, the land in between is called Mesopotamia. So you could say that Gozan was in Mesopotamia. It's actually around the city of Haran, where Abraham's father was buried, up in that area. So the Israelites first settled in Gozan on the Habor River and around Hala on the Tigris. Later transfers were also to Media near the Caspian Sea. You can see Media on there on the map. And soon after, the Israelites were joined by most of the population of Judah. Yeah, actually, most of the cities of Judah were seized by the Assyrians as well, and they took them off as well, excepting those Jews in Jerusalem itself. I expect there were some who survived elsewhere, but in the main, those other cities were destroyed by the Assyrians and the people carried off. So these exiles were put with the other captives. So really there were 12 tribes in exile, not just 10. So although we could talk about the lost tribes of Israel as being 10, there were a lot of Jews with them as well. And the Jews included also the tribe of Benjamin. So and the Levite priests. So there would have been Benjamites and Levites as well as Judahites, who would call the Jews. However, a remnant of the Jews remained in Judea to be later exiled by the Babylonians, and later they returned, as you know. The Assyrians knew the Israelites as the Bit Homria, meaning house of Omri. Omri was a previous king of northern Israel who founded Samaria, the city of Samaria. So Omri, he was a pretty important man, king, not a very good king, but he was an important man. The Assyrians knew of him because they demanded and received tribute from King Jehu, a son of Omri. And you can see on the black obelisk in the British Museum as a little cartouche or whatever you call it of Omri bowing down to the king, and making the offerings. The gifts are being brought to buy them off. Worked for a time, but not for very long. Now, we discussed this in the last lecture, but I can quickly recap. Omri is spelt like that in Hebrew, and you have a letter at the start of the name that's sort of like a G, but not pronounced. So it should also be pronounced Gomri. It's this sort of guttural sound, almost not spoken. Gomri. And that becomes Cumri or Gomri when transliterated. As the Assyrians, like the Hebrews, didn't have vowels in their alphabet, this could easily be pronounced Cumri or Gumri. So it didn't have to be Gomri, it could be Gumri. It depends on dialect, and you find this with languages. If you do a bit of study of languages, if I've done, you find that names and words change a lot according to the different places they're being spoken, because often people didn't write things down or they didn't have a dictionary. And so they wrote as they heard, and accents and things could be different. So names do tend to change over time. And the captives from Israel soon became known as the Gamir or the Gumri. And the Greeks knew these people by the name Chimaerioi, which in English is Chimerians. So all this was in the last lecture. I'm just recapping here, and if you want to know more on that subject, you should look at that lecture. The Aratian or Ararat Empire lays to the north of Assyria, more or less corresponds with ancient Armenia, most of which is in Turkey, not in the little Armenia we know today, which is just a remnant of Armenia, a much bigger territory in the old days. And in 708 BC, the Urartian king attacked Mane, a former Urartian territory where the Assyrians had placed some of the Gimri. So down in the south of Urartu, down there, was the part which had been clipped off by the Assyrians, called Mane. There were Mane people living there. Well, I think most of them have been transported elsewhere, probably to the Holy Land, actually. They became Sumerians or Samaritans. To everyone's surprise, the Gimri routed the Urartian army, and I talked about this in the last lecture, where I know about this from. The king of Urartu fleeing for his life, and these Gimri now escaped through Urartu. So having defeated the army, defeated the king, and the king's run off, they said, all right, that's our chance, guys, let's go. And they went up into Urartu, up to Lake Van, which was the capital. Van was the capital of Urartu. And they went there, probably sacked it, and then they went off and across the river, the River Halys, I think it's called. They escaped over the Halys River and settled in Pontus, which is on the south side of the Black Sea, initially. And in 679, a second group of Gimri from Assyria itself rebelled against the Assyrians. Though the rebellion was quelled, many escaped up the Euphrates Valley. They were able to join others in Pontus. So we had a second group who escaped from Assyria at this time. I think more escaped later, actually, with the fall of the Assyrian Empire in full, not that long after this. So they were able to go and join the others up in Samaria. And you've got to understand here that these deportations were not just a handful of people, a few thousand. We're talking about maybe up to 1 million or more people have been deported. So this was a large number of Israelites who were deported out to these areas to go and plough the fields or, carry on trades or businesses, craftsmen and things for the Assyrians. But they didn't want to be there. They wanted to do their own thing. The Cimmerians, or Gimri, were a formidable force in Asia Minor at this time, after they had escaped. They sacked Gordian, capital of Phrygia, in 695 BC. Midas, you have heard of King Midas, the one who everything he touched would turn to gold, and then his daughter rushed up and hugged him and she turned into gold and he was devastated. Well, that's obviously a mythical legend, but there was actually a King Midas of Gordian. But he was defeated and his capital was sacked, and he was so upset he's said to have killed himself by drinking ox blood. Now, that seems a very strange way of committing suicide. Are they really talking about drinking himself to death with wine? I don't know. But sad end to his golden career, you could say. And the ruins of Gordian confirm that it was indeed burnt around that time. The city, there's a burnt layer from around that time. And there's a big tumulus tomb of Midas, King Midas' tomb at Gordian. And I've actually been to that and seen it. You can go through a long tunnel into the chamber inside. And it was obviously magnificent. And they found various treasures which they have in a little museum there. Very interesting if you're ever going that way, but it's a bit out of the way in the middle of Anatolia. A bit far away from everything except perhaps Ankara, I suppose. In 662 and again in 652, they sacked Sardis, the capital of Lydia. So Lydia was another kingdom. Phrygia was one big kingdom and Lydia was another one further west. And they sacked it. The first time they didn't actually manage to conquer it. The second time they were more successful and they sacked it again. Unfortunately, Herodotus, now you've heard of Herodotus or Herodot, who was considered to be the father of history. He wrote a book, his histories, and his histories what would not quite be called history today. There were more tales and legends and mythology and all sorts of things piled in there. But he does give an outline of a good amount of history, but some of it he has to just imagine, or he says, well, this seems to be the truth. And unfortunately, people have taken a lot of these things as gospel, which they shouldn't be. A lot of it was actually supposition or just rumour or gossip. So unfortunately, Herodotus, writing in the mid-6th century, so more than 150 years later, made the assumption that the Cimmerioi, the Cimmerians, must have been wild nomads from the Russian steppes. Now again, I discussed that in the last lecture. But he knew nothing of Israel or the Israelites and doesn't even mention the Jews. He didn't know anything about these people at all. And at that time, prior to Alexander, Judea was not a part of the Greek world. So it was, he didn't know anything about what was going on earlier with the Jews and Judea, the Israelites. He didn't know anything of any of that. And he was not to know that the Israelites were good horsemen, especially those tribes from Gilead. Now we'll talk about Gilead shortly. They didn't need to have come from the Russian steppes, no, to be good horsemen. The Israelites were fierce warriors too. Just read the Old Testament. Yeah, well, the Old Testament is a horrifying story of cities being attacked and razed and all people killed. In the first book of Kings and the books of Judges and so on, parts of the Exodus. It's a quite harrowing story of how the first kingdom of Israel was founded and how they came in possession of Canaan. So they're quite capable of being chimerians, believe me. Anyway, around the time they were sacking Lydia, that's Sardis, or soon after, the Chimerians started to enter Europe. They first crossed the Bosphorus to enter Thrace. Now the Bosphorus, if you don't know, is the narrow strait leading into the Black Sea. It's where Istanbul is. In the old days it was called Constantinople. And there's only a very small, narrow entrance leading from the Sea of Marmara into the Black Sea. And it's a very important choke point if you're wanting to control this region. Because if you control that choke point, you actually control access to the Black Sea, or vice versa, Black Sea into the Mediterranean. It's actually happening now, isn't it, in this Ukrainian-Russian war. Turkey controls that choke point, and they're not allowing warships from either side, actually, to go in or out of the Black Sea. And maybe they'll let them go out, but they're not letting any go in, which is frustrating the Russians enormously. But, that's part of the treaty they have, international treaty, that they will have that control over that seaway. So that's the first place that people crossed over, and you could actually cross over. I think it was the Persians actually crossed over that strait by putting boats one next to the other, so they could walk across the boats to get into Thrace. I don't think the Chimerians would have done that, but you could ship people across quite easily. You didn't have a bridge there at the time. There is a bridge now, more than one. But you can imagine they could ferry people across into the area opposite, which is called Thrace. And W.E. Filmer, we discussed him as his documents that I've been looking at and talking about, where I've got a lot of this information from. He believed that this was in fulfillment of a prophecy in the second book of Esdras, and I'm going to read that prophecy out to you now, if I can find it. Now then, where's my magnifying glass? Very, very small print in this Bible. It's actually, the book of Esdras is one of or two books of Esdras in the Apocrypha, and you won't find those in the King James Version or ordinary King James Version. You will in a Catholic Bible or an Orthodox Bible, but for some reason King James left them out. But anyway, there they are. They are important books, and they contain a lot of information in the period after the sort of Babylonian period and the prophecies to do with that, and before the time of the New Testament. There's a big gap of time in the Bible, and these books cover that gap, particularly during the Persian Empire, what was going on. So, talking about, and whereas thou sawest, he gathered another peaceable multitude unto him. I'm jumping in the middle here. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Osea, the king, whom Salmanassar, the king of Assyria, led away captive. So that's Shalmaneser the third, and I think Osea is Hosea in the Bible. He led them away captive. He carried them over the waters, that would be the Euphrates it's talking about here, and so came they into another land. No, they're taken into Assyria and also into Media. But they took this counsel among themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathens and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. So actually that's not true that never mankind dwelt there, but it was far away, that people didn't know where this place was, what was going on there. As far as they were concerned, that was wilderness. That they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. So they've been disobedient to the laws of God that lay down on Mount Sinai at the time of Moses. They haven't obeyed them then, but now they were going to do that, or so Esdras believes. And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river. Now those narrow passages are the gorges up in Comagena, that if you follow the Euphrates up going towards Turkey, the Euphrates is a great river that runs through Syria and Iraq. You go the other way upstream, you come into Turkey. And these days, if you go up there, you're going to come to the great Ataturk Dam, which I've seen, a huge thing, and a great lake behind it. But that lake was gorge, very deep canyons there. And they could follow these canyons up through Comagena. And that way they could get up, into the hinterland, you might say, and take them all the way up to Eratu eventually. By the narrow passages of the river. For the Most High then showed signs for them and held still the flood till they were passed over. So that's the sort of hinting back to Moses. Perhaps they're saying that the Euphrates kind of dried up. If it was in full stream, you wouldn't be able to do that. But if it's running low, because perhaps after a few dry years and in the summertime, you might be able to do that, to go up the river through these gorges. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Azareth. So I'm going to read that again. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Azareth. Then dwelt they there until the latter time, and now when they shall begin to come. Right, so they're going to a place called Azareth, he's saying, he's prophesying or relating. It's around his time we're talking. And they're going to dwell there until the end days, he's basically saying. So this place called Azareth, and you can see it on the map here in Europe. He says it's 1.5 years from Euphrates. Well, if you're going on foot, Turkey is very mountainous, It's not an easy place to go through. So if you're going to walk by on foot, you would have to go all the way and cross over the Bosphorus into Thrace, and then you would have to work your way up there to get up into Europe. I think Azareth is what we would call Europe today. So Filmo interprets Azareth as meaning Europe, west and north of the Black Sea. It is said to lie a year and a half distant from the Euphrates, a long way on foot. At some point, and for reasons we will discuss shortly, the Gimri, or Cimmerians, mostly became known as Gauls or Celts. I'll explain that shortly. As such, they penetrated Europe more deeply by following river valleys. The most important of these was the river Danube, which, as you probably know, starts in Germany, flows through Austria, Hungary, down to Romania and Moldova, into the Black Sea. So they're going the other way up from the Black Sea. up towards into Europe. So the most important of these was the river Danube. The Gauls followed the Danube upstream through Romania, Hungary, Austria, and into southern Germany. From there, they passed over the river Rhine into Gaul, which we now call France. You probably know that. Other groups of Cimmerians found a different route into Europe, eventually reaching what is now the Jutland Peninsula, the part of Denmark that is joined to the mainland of Europe. Now, if you ever looked at a map of Europe, if you're European, you probably know this only too well. You have, Germany and France joined together, and then you have this peninsula sticking up into the sea, separating the Baltic, which is the eastern part of a sort of basin, a bit like a northern Mediterranean, you could say, and it goes all the way with Sweden and Finland on one side, and you've got Germany and Poland, and then the Baltic states, and then eventually you got Russia at the other end. So that's the Baltic, and on the other side of the Jutland Peninsula you've got the North Sea, and the other side of the North Sea, of course, is Britain, and north from there you've got going up to Norway. So you could say that the Jutland Peninsula divides the ocean, or the North Sea, from the Baltic. So there's another important choke point is there to control shipping and control movements of trade and people. So the Gimri, or another bunch of them, are Cimmerians. They've gone up there to Jutland, and they've established there, perhaps in northern bit of Germany as well. And these groups are known to history as the Gimri, a name clearly deriving from Cymru. Now, I'll just say a couple of words there that in Britain we also have the Cymru as the Welsh. They call themselves the Cymru. And Wales is also known as Cambria. That got that B in it, just like Cimbria or Gimri, the Jutland. Wales is known as Cambria. And also we have Cumberland in England. That was sort of very Welshy sort of part of England, before the Anglo-Saxon conquest, which we'll discuss in later lectures. But so we do have this connection between the Cimmerians and the Gimri. Now, if you talk to modern scholars and historians, they'll shout at you and go red in the face when you say this, because they believe that these Gimri were, nomads from Asia. They know nothing about the migrations of the 10 tribes, and if you try to explain it to them, they just get angry. So I've given up trying, but it's very obvious when you go into it in depth. So these groups are known to history as the Gimri, a name clearly derived from Cymru. Now, around 390 BC, so we've moved on a bit here, a coalition of Celtic tribes from Gaul and Britain, along with Gimri from Germany and Jutland, so they all got together and they invaded Italy. They defeated the Romans in the Battle of Allia and went on to sack Rome. It was a raiding party, basically. The Gauls were very into that. You can go and raid cities to get all their treasure. And the Cimmerians had been doing this back in Asia Minor. So this is a tradition. So they were raiding Italy, and they were raiding Etruscan cities, and the Romans came out and said, we will stand by you and defend you. But that wasn't the Rome of the later. This was just a city-state Rome, and they weren't strong enough to defeat these people, and they ended up sacking Rome. That's not often taught to us. 390 BC. Now the Bible tells us. Now I'm going to go into a different tack here. We're going to talk about how these names came about and the nature of these different tribes that we're talking about and why they were as they were. So the Bible tells us that the tribe of Naphtali was the first to be carried off by the Assyrians, and that was in 732 BC. And the tribe of Naphtali lived in northern Israel within part of Galilee. So the large part of Galilee, actually, Galilee, and that's a lovely part of the country, I have to say. If I were going to live in Israel, that's the part I would choose. I worked on a kibbutz there, up on the Golan Heights, right up in the north, and it was a paradise, in the Hula Valley, orange trees growing everywhere and farming, and it was paradise. Had been a malarial swamp before the Israelis came and drained the swamp land and got rid of the mosquitoes and started, farming. And all credit to them for that. So that's Naphtali, and they were in that part which is called Galilee. And you've heard of the Sea of Galilee. Well, that's in the southern bit down there of the tribe of Naphtali. Next to go were the tribes who lived on the east bank of the Jordan. These were the half-tribe of Manasseh, the tribe of Gad, and the tribe of Reuben. And this area was called Gilead or Galeed. Now, what does that mean, and what's that all about? Well, before I go into that, just want to say the reason that these tribes were taken away first was that this area had been conquered by Syria earlier on. Not that much earlier, but earlier on it had been conquered. So it was considered now to be Syrian territory. The Assyrians came in and they defeated, the Assyrians defeated the Syrians. It gets complicated, isn't it? But they defeated them in battle. So they took over all their land, and they took this land, which was now considered to be Syrian, as far as the Assyrians were concerned, and they deported those people. So all that land, which was east of the Jordan River, would be now in the, I think all of that will now be inside what we call the country of Jordan. Now, I would suggest that the name Galilee, Gilead, and Gilgal all derive from Galeed. If we remember that in ancient Hebrew they didn't write vowels, these names all begin with GL. So Gil, Gal, Gal, Gol, it all depends on how you hear it and your accent as to what vowel you're using. It's not written into the language, or wasn't at that time. In Hebrew these days they use dots for vowels, but they didn't in those days. And Galeed itself means heap of witness. Yeah. So there's a story in the Bible about when Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, he marries the two daughters of his uncle that he's been working for. And, he's worked for him for 20 years. And he's got his sheep, he's got his children, he's got his household. And he decides now, or God tells him now, it's the time to go home, back to the promised land. So he leaves with all his stuff, and the uncle and his son, the sons of the uncle, say, "Hey, he's going off with all the stuff. That belongs to us, doesn't it?" You can imagine the family quarrel. They come chasing after him, and Jacob has a meeting with his uncle, and the uncle says, your house is my house. They're my daughters. They're my grandchildren. How can we have a fight? They're my blood. And they agree to respect each other, and they put up a heap of stones to mark the borderland between their two territories. So Galeed itself means a heap of witness. They build up this heap of stones to mark the boundary, and have a big party. So Galeed refers to an agreement made between Jacob and Israel and his father-in-law, Laban, that they would not invade each other's land. They raised a heap of stones to mark the boundary, and you find that all in Genesis 31, chapter 31, verses 41 to 48. And this heap was at a place called Ramoth Gilead, or Galeed. And there you can see it, Ramoth Gilead. The pile of stones was raised at Ramoth Gilead. This marked the border of Israel's land and Aramean land. The Arameans were the people of Haran and so on. And you heard of the language Aramaic as being very similar to Hebrew. In fact, I'll tell you a story. I'd been to Haran and I'd been to Edessa, which is now called Urfa or Sanurfa, just a little to the north of Haran. And I've taken some pictures of tombstones going way back, written in Aramaic on these tombstones. And I showed one of these pictures to Uri Geller, who I knew, and he said, I can read that. That's written in Hebrew. And he said, I can read that. I said, well, actually, it's Aramaic. It's from Edessa. So that shows that the two were closely related, and the people of the Arameans were closely related to the Israelites, going back to the time of Abraham, maybe before. So that's at Ramoth Gilead. The Syrian invasions changed everything. Aram was first conquered. Its principal city of Haran, where Abraham's father was buried, became the western capital of the Assyrian Empire. So they'd taken Haran. I've been to Haran, and it's an interesting place. It's all in ruins now, but there was a famous Battle of Carrhae, or Haran, was fought there between the Parthians and the Romans. And the entire Roman army was routed and destroyed. And Crassus, who was triumvir with Pompey and Caesar, he was killed there. So it was a very important place in ancient times, and you can still go there, and it's interesting ruins. Anyway, so that's where Abraham's father was buried. It became the western capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Arameans and Syrians were also enslaved. Yeah, they were, deported as well. At the same time, the 3.5 tribes of Israelites from Galilee and Gilead were deported to Haran and to the Habor River. And you can see that here. The Habor River was in Gozan, right? It flows up, or flows down, I suppose, into the Euphrates. It's a tributary of the Euphrates, and Haran is up there. So the Habor River was in Gozan, so that would have been the sort of area where, Laban and Jacob had worked when he was young. It seems to me likely that the Israelites from Gilead in Galilee were known as Gileadim or Galedim. This name was likely shortened to Galim. Now, I haven't got proof for this, but it makes sense to me that if you were someone from Haran, you would look at these people and say, oh, yeah, the Gileadim who come, they should be on the other side of the stone, shouldn't they? But the Assyrians have brought them into here. So they would have been understood as Gileadim, and that could easily be shortened to Galim. Very likely this was the name they used for themselves. Yeah, well, instead of saying, well, I'm a Reubenite, or, a Manassehite or something, you just say, oh, well, I'm a Galim. Shortened, everyone knows where Gilead is, Galim, the other side of the stones. Makes sense. It would refer to the fact that they came from beyond Ramoth Gilead, the heap of stones. So they all settled up there, and in Hala, which is on the river Tigris or Tigris, or as the Turks call it, the Dinkley, which flows down to the Persian Gulf. And when the Cimmerians, the Gimri, began their invasion of Europe, it seems they preferred to use their own name deriving from Galim. In Greek, they were now called Galatae, which became in Latin Galli. In English, we would say Gauls, and I believe that this is where this name Gauls or Galli comes from. They weren't people who were, indigenous to Central Europe or Germany or somewhere, and then invaded down into other places and crossed over the Bosphorus into Turkey. These were the people going the other way and coming into Europe. There were a later wave. Yes, there had been people living there. Obviously, there had. You can consult all the archaeology for that. You can find that. But we're talking around about the late Iron Age, 500. The Iron Age, an invasion coming from the east, and it wasn't wandering nomads from the steppes. This was people who coming from originally Israel, but from Assyria and through Turkey, coming up that way. They knew all about metalcraft and how to make things and cast bronzes and gold, and you talk about all this lovely gold stuff that they made. They were craftsmen with them. They weren't just cowboys out on the range. They did that as well, but they had a lot of skills and they brought those with them. So in Greek, I've done that. The Greek name Keltai or Keltoi, i.e. Celtic or Celts, simply derives from Galatae, or what we would say Galatians. So the Celts, just putting a Celt instead of a G. So the Galatae or Galais, and they become the Keltoi or Keltae, Celts. So they're the same thing as Gauls, basically. And they were crossing over and coming into Europe. Now known as Keltae or Galli, Celts or Gauls, the Cimmerian Israelites from 600 to 100 BC pressed westwards from Germany into Gaul proper, what is now called France. So France is called Gaul, and if you think about it, the French name for Wales, even today, is Pays de Galles, land of the Gauls. It makes sense, doesn't it? And you can call them the Gimri as well. They're the same people. They're the Celts, they're the Calais, the Gimri. They're all the same people, and they're descended from these lost tribes of Israel. From there, some migrated southwards from France, that is, or Gaul, into Spain, where they were known by the Romans of Celt Iberians. So they were the Iberians or the Celts who lived in Iberia, and they would have occupied a lot of northern Spain, the sort of Barcelona type area. And they, as we have seen, the Gimri, who inhabited Denmark and Frisia, were Cimmerians who came by a different route. Other groups invaded southern England, where they were known as Belgae. Thus we see common tribal names on both sides of the English Channel, e.g. you had the Belgae who had their capital at what's now called Winchester, and you had the Atrebates. They had lands on both France and Britain. So these Belgae, the southern British, were these Celtic tribes particularly, linked closely with the continent. And Cyrus, or Cyrus if you prefer, Cyrus, the king of Persia, invaded Asia Minor and captured Sardis. We talked about Sardis before, being raided twice, the capital of Lydia, in 546 BC. He made it into the regional capital of that part of the Turkish Empire. He had a big road built that went all the way back to Persia. He took its king Croesus prisoner, effectively taking control over the western half of Anatolia. So the exact relationship between the Persians and Galatians or Galatians is not clear. The Persians invaded Macedonia and took over Thrace in the 510s. So we're coming up, closer to our time, 510s BC this is. And this no doubt helped to propel more Cimmerians, Galatians, to move westward up the Danube River to Western Europe. You've got the Persians coming in here. They want to conquer Greece, primarily. That's what they're about. They'd had big wars with the Greek cities and the Greeks helping them. They're going to punish the Greeks. So they come in, cross the Bosphorus again into Thrace, and then they're going to go down and attack Greece. The Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Salamis, and so on. It's going to go on. And the Greeks will actually defeat them. But but you can imagine the effect on any Cimmerians who are hanging around in Thrace is, let's get out of here, boys. Get up the river. We're going to join our brothers further up in this Ashtaroth, the nice place in Europe. Alexander the Great invaded the Persian Empire in 334 BC. By the time of his death in 323 BC, it's a very short life he had, but in 11 years there, he had built an empire that stretched from Macedonia, that's just north of Greece, or northern part of Greece, to the Indus River in India, so all the way, and actually over the other side of the bits of the Indus. So he's built this huge empire. It included Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, and Afghanistan. The parts of Afghanistan were called Bactria in those days, and that's where you get the Bactrian camels from. Alexander's exact relationship with the Galatians of Anatolia is far from clear. It seems likely that they survived as a satrapy throughout the Persian period. A satrapy is a dependent state who paid taxes, tribute, whatever. In the case of the Galatians, it wasn't a very rich province, but they probably provided things like horses, I would think, that you graze out on the steppes there. Maybe some other things too, but basically I think they would have kept their heads down at that time. Following Alexander's death, Anatolia fell to the lot of General Seleucus. Most historians assumed that the Cimmerians, Galatians, had long since disappeared, but I see no evidence for this. I've been trying to look this up, and I can't see any references. They just say, the Cimmerians, they're just sort of melted away into the general population. They're gone, they're finished, forget them. I don't see any evidence for that. I think they probably kept their heads down and just stayed in that area in the central plains of Turkey, as we call it now, up near Ankara, near Gordian, which they'd sacked earlier, up in that area. It's a bit of a wilderness area, a wild steppe, and not much in the way of cities there, so they'd probably be left to themselves. So I don't believe they disappeared. Meanwhile, in 279 BC, it's recorded that Gauls from Central and Western Europe looted Delphi in Greece. That was the great oracle of Greece, Delphi or Delphi, where there were people had been coming there for centuries, asking the priestesses to tell their fortune, and they give very ambiguous prophecies on fortune telling. They sat in sort of, I think, of some kind of gas coming out from the rocks, and they get into a kind of hallucinatory trance, and they would give them a prophecy from the gods, Apollo, particularly from Apollo, and they would give them ambiguous advice. So in return, they were given stuff, gold, silver, treasure, lots of stuff for Apollo and the other god. There are other temples there as well. Reward the gods, they're going to help us, give them good stuff, they'll help us. So you imagine that's a nice rich plum there waiting to be picked. And so the Gauls came down there and they raided it. And they're rumoured to have taken tons of gold and silver from the temples of Delphi back to Gaul. The Romans believed that this was buried somewhere near Toulouse. So I don't think anyone's found it, the rumoured treasure of the Delphi temples looted by the Gauls. Around 279, the Galatians are known to have also been active in Asia Minor, so that's around the same time. And they sacked various Greek cities on the coast. In 270, there were these Greek cities on the coast, starting with Miletus in the south and going all the way up, different cities. So they were sort of working their way along, helping themselves. And some of these cities decided to pay them stuff to go away, don't come here. It's better to give them the stuff now before they loot and destroy your city. Makes sense, doesn't it? So anyway, they sacked various Greek cities, and in 275 they fought the Battle of the Elephants against Antiochus Epiphanes IV. I think both sides had elephants, and I don't know where they got them from, but must have been elephants kicking around, I guess. And afterwards they retired back to Galatia in the centre of what is now Turkey. Now, I should say that the standard answer is that these Galatians crossed over the Bosphorus and did all this looting and stuff. And then they got cut off and they formed this little kingdom of Galatia. But I think they were already there, Because modern historians don't realise that the Cimmerians, Gauls and Celts were all just different names for the same people, they think the Galatians reverse invaded Asia Minor from Thrace. So they think they came back the other way over the Dardanelles. I don't see that they would need to do that. They're already there. I believe that the Oriental Galatians were descendants of the Cimmerians who had never left the area. And their descendants would receive letters from St. Paul. So you got St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. You can read that in your Bible. They were converted to Christians, or at least some of them were. So you still have the Galata Tower in Istanbul, and Galata or Galatia is still a province in Turkey today. I don't know how many of the people living there are descended from Galatians. Probably not very many, I would think, but maybe there's some. Anyway, it is possible and even likely that the Cimmerians, the Gimri, who became known as Galatae, Celts or Gauls, were descended at least in part from the tribes who were taken from Gilead and Galilee. So I think this is, more specific here. And these were Naphtali from Galilee, Reuben, Gad and half of Manasseh from Gilead, and the last three would certainly have been accomplished horsemen. Gilead was cattle grazing country requiring horsemen to act as cowboys. They were not city dwellers, and so were already well adapted to take on an active nomadic life as Cimmerians. So this is how we get our Gauls and Gads and Gileads and so on. These guys were horsemen. Not everybody was living the city life in Jerusalem or Samaria or somewhere. A lot of people are living out in the country, either in small towns or like these guys, out looking after their cattle. And you'd need to be a horseman to do that, wouldn't you? In the prophecies of Israel over his sons in Genesis 49, he says this is them. I want to bring it back to the Bible here. And I'm going to give you a couple of quotes about these specific tribes. In chapter 49, I think it is, in the book of Genesis, you have the story of Israel, Jacob, and he's making prophecies about his 12 sons. And when he talks about the sons, he means the tribes that are going to descend from those sons. So the the whole tribe is the son. Yeah, that's how they talk. So when he gives a prophecy over Benjamin, say, or over Joseph or something, he's talking about all the people, what's going to happen to his tribe, his people. So he says here of Reuben, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. So he's strong, he's dignified, but he's unstable as water. He keeps vacillating, he can't make his mind up, he changes his mind. You shall not have preeminence, so he's not going to make him the top dog, even though he's the firstborn. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Right, so obviously Reuben has has sex with one of Israel, Jacob's concubines. And he doesn't like that at all. He's defiled my couch. So bad boy. You're not going to have preeminence. He's passed over. And actually he passes over the other two next ones, 2 and 3, because they've been violent and they're very horrible people. So he goes to son number 4, who's Judah, and he's the one he's going to give the rulership staff to. He's going to be the king. His tribe are going to be the kingly tribe, which they are. So there's a tradition that France is the modern embodiment of Reuben. I don't know if you ever heard that. They say that the French are descended from Reubenites. The cock, the French cock, that struts around, very showing off his tail and that's considered to be a symbol of pride. So Reuben, the firstborn, the might of the first fruits of thy strength, is preeminent in dignity, who's a bit nose in the air, but also very randy. The French have that reputation, don't they? I'll leave it there. But proud and unstable and inclined to adultery. Let's just leave it there, shall we? Probably not true. Probably just a myth. For Gad it says, raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. That's in Genesis 49:19. The raiders prophesies the Assyrian invasion of Gilead. So Gilead is getting raided, and Gad is one of the parts of Gilead. Raiding at their heels perhaps refers to the nomadic raiding by the Cimmerians. So they're going to reverse raid. So they've been raided, carried off by the Assyrians. But in turn, they're going to escape from there, and they're going to be raiding everyone else, including bits of Assyria. So were the Belgae of the Low Countries and southern Britain representative of Gad? Prophecy would fit. I don't know. I put that there because they were raiding Delphi and raiding Rome. These people. Maybe that was the Gad influence in them. They're going to go out and get some booty from where it's easy pickings. Vikings as well would be having that genetic disposition, you might say. Manasseh was the elder son of Joseph, though his younger brother received the chief blessing of Israel. You can read that in the earlier chapter 38. Joseph's prophecy is, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring, a bough being a tree or, growing out. His branches run over the wall. Right, well, Manasseh goes over the Jordan River. It's on both sides. Very big territory they had in Gilead and in Israel proper. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him and harassed him severely, yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. So this is the prophecy of Manasseh, and also, of course, Ephraim as well, who's the other son of Joseph. Now, certainly the tribal lands of Manasseh ran over the wall, so over the Golan Heights and into Gilead. Also the rich land of Bashan to the north of Gilead and east of the Sea of Galilee was bestowed on the tribe of Manasseh by Joshua. So they've got loads of good stuff. So Manasseh was a very large, richly endowed tribe. In addition to half of Gilead and all of Bashan, it had large amounts of land on the western side of the Jordan. Today, many Bible scholars believe that the United States is the embodiment of Manasseh with all its blessings. We might go into that a bit more later. It's generally believed that England is Ephraim, the other brother, largely because all of these tribes are linked to signs of the zodiac. Ephraim was the original, the land originally allocated to Joseph would have gone to Ephraim because he got the chief blessing. And Joseph, the tribe of Joseph, is allocated to Taurus, the bull, in the zodiac. So that becomes Ephraim. His brother Manasseh would be Gemini, the next door tribe, next door sign to Taurus. So the two together is actually linked to Orion, which is in between the two, but that's another story. There's the John Bull type with the red face and, very much a symbol to do with England and the stubbornness of the English. Anyway, that's another story. So many people think that Manasseh is the United States, and we'll come to that another time. Of course, this is now over 2,850 years since the first deportations of Israelites by Shalmaneser III of Assyria. So it's a long time ago that these first deportations happened. And since then, they have mixed with all the tribes of Israelites, all manner of other nations and tribes, adopting different languages and customs as they did so. The raiding and pillaging Cimmerians would have taken wives, concubines and slaves from numerous groups they encountered. And even before their exile, the northern Israelites had lost their religion and adopted other gods. Yeah, that's why they're being punished, kicked out. You had other gods before me. The first commandment in the Ten Commandments, you shall have no gods before me. Well, they did. And this is why they were banished from the Holy Land, or so the Bible tells us. The various tribes of the Gauls and Cimmerians would have carried other names based on more recent patrimonies than the ancient sons of Israel. So they've been called other tribes, Atrabates or whatever. They're going to have other names, aren't they? And speaking diverse languages with religious practices alien to their ancestors from the times of David, they would have been unrecognizable as Israelites, just as Americans today are, for the most part, a heterogeneous nation made from diverse immigrants and native groups. So they've all got mixed up with other peoples and other tribes and other groups. I think it's very hard to say that someone is tribe of Reuben or something. Could be any one of the other tribes mixed in there. Not to mention all the other people who were already living in that place when they moved in, and then they intermixed with them, maybe even some Neanderthals or whatever. You never know. We live in modern times, but the strains are in there somewhere, is what we say. The lost tribes are not lost; they're in there somewhere. It's difficult to put your finger and say, well, he's a tribe of Joseph, he's a tribe of Gad or whatever. Naphtali over there. I don't think you can do that. They're all mixed up together and with other things as well. But they're there. Now you may be wondering how it is that the Gimri, Cimmerians and Gauls spoke different languages from Hebrew and forgot their origins in Israel. I've wondered that. Why didn't these guys keep their own language? How come they're now talking German or English or French or Spanish or I don't know, Polish or whatever? These other languages that have grown up. Well, if you believe in God, the answer, I think, is very simple. The lost tribes were banished from the Holy Land because of bad behaviour. That's what we're told in the Bible. They were bad boys and girls. Now then, that's all I want to say for now about the Cimmerians and the Gauls and so on, but I've left out a whole other load of Israelites. We're going to have to deal with them, and I'll do that in the next lecture. So we're going to discuss the impact of the next group of Israelites, invaders to enter Europe, and their impact on European history, the people known as the Scythians, who again are not from southern Russia. They are not these wandering Cronin the barbarians. They are actually another bunch of the Israelites, and we'll talk about them in the next lecture. So I hope you found this interesting. Do watch the earlier programs if you haven't done so already, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much for your time, and if you can find it in your heart, do have a look at my Patreon page, patreon.com, Adrian G. Gilbert, and you'll find details of how you can join the college if you want to. Thank you very much, and we'll speak again. Bye-bye.